Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch this. My name is Gary Elder, and this video is going to cover the component editing assignment for Intro Maya. The purpose of this assignment is to allow the student to practice with manipulating objects in the viewport, practice with snapping and pivot placement, as well as practice modeling by editing an object's components, that is, its vertices, edges, and its faces. Start with the provided scene and rename it to match the assignment requirements. The blue link, component editing, is the scene you're going to download and use, and the Maya scene file name convention is down here as well. Recreate each of the objects by first creating primitive objects, editing their primitive initial settings, and then positioning their components. Each object should be recreated to within 0.01 units of accuracy. Each object should be modeled from a single contiguous starting object and should not be built using multiple separate objects. Group objects to match the provided formation. Name the final group and the contained objects. Center the object pivots. Freeze transformations and delete all construction history. And down here at the bottom you can see how you'll be graded for this assignment. So now that we've covered all the basis of what the expectations for the assignment are, let's jump into Maya and I'll cover the creation of each object in detail. Once you have the assignment downloaded and you've opened it up in Maya, the first thing I would suggest doing is making sure that you get it renamed to match the provided name convention on the assignment. That way, just every couple of minutes when you're done with the shape, you can save over it and you won't lose any of your work. You're going to notice we have 6 objects that we need to make, and currently they are combined into a single object, but the assignment asks for them to be grouped so that we'll wind up with one group that contains 6 objects when we're done. A few things you may want to note while you're working on this is that the full shaded mode it's probably not the easiest way to work while you're trying to match up objects. So I'm going to hit spacebar, and in each of my viewports I'm going to get it set up so it's going to be a little easier. First thing I'm going to do is just turn the grid off in my orthographic views to make my life a little bit better, and then I'm going to take the shading tab and set each of these so that they have wire on shade checked as well as X-ray. And this is going to make them a little more see-through without being completely wireframe, so that we'll get a bit of depth, but we can see our primitives as we line them up. Now that we have this, we're ready to start. I'm going to start back here in this corner with this wedge shape, and what we want to do is analyze the shape and try to pick a primitive that starts out as closely shaped or as accurately and even topology as we can. So you'll notice that this thing has 6 external faces, so do cubes. So a cube is going to be the easiest place to start. We can create a cube up here top left on the poly modeling shelf. You can also go to the create menu so long as you're in your modeling tool set. We can go to create, poly primitives, and cube is in here as well. Either way works fine. And once we create the cube, it's going to drop in at 0, so we need to get it moved over here so that we can work with it. Easy way to do this is to tap spacebar and come into your top viewport and simply just translate this over in space until it is more or less somewhere in the center of this wedge shape. I'm going to hit F and focus in on it. Now at this point we could manipulate all of these vert corners, align them with the outside of the provided object, and this is a good chance to be using snapping modes as well. The way that you're going to jump in and out of component mode, right now I'm in object selection. If you're on a Windows machine, F8 is object mode, F9 is vertice mode, F10 is edges, and F11 is faces. Another way that we can do this, if you come up to the modeling toolkit, we can change the component selection type right here at the top, object, vert, edge, and face. The way that I prefer is in the viewport itself, hover over the object that you want to work with and hold down your right mouse. This will pop up a little fly window and you can pick a component right from here. So I'm going to go to vertice mode, and now you can see that we are able to either click select or drag select components. There's a few different things we can do with component selections. Let me make another slightly more complicated shape, something that has more topology on it to show you this. I'm going to go back into vertice mode and temporarily take this view out of X-ray. Vertices, edges, faces, etc. can be simply clicked while holding Shift, and this will add to the selection. Shift is a toggle, however. It will add or subtract depending on whether the vertice is already selected or not. Holding Control always deselects, regardless of whether the vertice is selected or not. And this works with dragging too. So if I had vertices selected here and I wanted to add some from over here, I could hold Shift and grab and the two will be added together. Or I could hold Control and drag and I could select and remove those. Another thing that we can do is nudge selections. So if I have two vertices selected and I use the arrow keys, I can bump the selection right or left, or up or down. But you need to keep in mind this is based on the camera's right, left, up, down, not necessarily the object's topology. We can grab a band of vertices by selecting one vertice, moving a few vertices over, holding down Shift and double clicking. And this will grab the vertices in between. And there's other things that we can do too. So for example, in edge mode, if you want to grab an edge loop that runs around an object, you can simply double click on a single edge and that will grab the edge loop. If you'd like to grab a row of edges that go the opposite direction of the edge loop, perpendicular to, we can first pick one, then hold Shift and double click one of the edges adjacent, and we'll be able to grab the band. This works in face mode as well. Faces, if you select, move over a few and hold Shift, you can grab a range. If you pick a single face, pick the adjacent face and double click, you can pick the loop, and we can do this either direction. And another thing that's really nice, in the modeling toolkit, there's a pick/marquee tool, which is what we're using right now, where we can single click or we can drag. And there's also the drag tool. The drag tool works like a paintbrush, where we can paint on the surface, and either holding Shift or Control we can add to or remove from by painting. More often than not, we're going to want this most likely in pick marquee. But the paint mode is really useful, especially for things like poles, where picking a single face and holding Shift and double clicking won't grab this range because they're not quads. If you're using drag selection, we could simply just paint a circle and it makes grabbing a pole really easy. So a little trick that I like is to leave my tool set in pick marquee, and every now and then when I want to paint a selection, I hold down Tab, and Tab temporarily enables paint selection, and when you let go, you're back to pick marquee, and that just seems a little bit easier. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about how to work with component selection, let's go back and find the cube that we were working with. I'm going to put my viewport back into X-ray mode. We're going to right mouse click and hold to go to vertex, or whichever other method you prefer. And then I'm going to snap each of these vertices to the corners where they belong. Here at the top, you've got your horseshoe magnets. If you don't see those, it's because this bar is collapsed, so you may need to click and expand it out. And right now what we want is to snap a vertex to another vertex. So the third tool in is point snapping. That's the one we want to use. We can simply turn it on by highlighting it, and once you see it blue, it is on. Or if you want to just temporarily use it, you can hold down V and it will stay on until you let V off. If you do hold the V key down, it does need to be held prior to grabbing a Move, Translate, or Rotate tool. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it on for now. Then I'll select a corner and hit W to go into translation mode. I can grab a single handle and aim my mouse point where I want it to snap, and I could do this in all three directions to place a point. Or if I grab the tool by the center, I can drag all three at the same time. Another thing interesting to note is that now that I've used the center of the tool, it's highlighted yellow. If I were to click on the X-axis, it's now highlighted yellow. Y the same, Z the same. And what we're actually doing here is constraining the tool to only work in those directions. And this is nice because, say I don't have snapping mode on and I have X constrained, I can now hold down the middle mouse button and slide, and I get a virtual slider in my viewport. This is useful for snapping. I'm going to turn vertice mode back on, vertice snapping, select another vertice, and click the center of the tool. Because it's allowed to move all three axes, and because vertice snapping is on, if I middle mouse aim and click hold, I can snap very easily and very quickly. Middle mouse drag, middle mouse drag, middle mouse drag. Or you can do this one vertice at a time, whichever you have the most control of, but this method is probably the fastest. Alright, now at this point we have our object complete, and if you'll remember in the instructions, we're supposed to delete construction history, freeze transforms, center the pivot of each object, name them, as well as group them. At this point, centering the pivot can be done a couple ways. If you're in your your poly modeling shelf, this button right here is center pivot, and you can see that it snaps down. If you're not there and you're not seeing this button, this is also found under Modify, Center Pivot, so long as you're in the modeling toolset. Deleting construction history can be found on the poly modeling shelf right here. It can also be found under Edit, Delete by Type, History, as well as the shortcut Alt-Shift-D. When that is done, you'll notice that the inputs will disappear from your channel box, as well as the attribute editor will only show the default node tabs as opposed to a potentially longer list. Freezing transformations. If you look in the channel box, we have translated our object, and these should be zeroed out with a scale of 1 when this object is at rest. So we can do that with the snowflake on the poly modeling shelf, or from Modify, Freeze Transformations. You may want to double check in the options box to make sure that it is set to the default, which is Translate, Rotate, Scale turned on, Joint Orient off, and Preserve Normals on. If you're not sure, you can always say Edit Reset Settings, and that will put it back. So I'm going to freeze the transforms. You'll now see that this is zeroed out. These are all at 1. In my outliner, I can select this shape and double click to edit its name, and I'm just going to give it whatever name that we want to call it. And then I'm going to group it. And the way that we group this is by selecting it and hitting Control G for group. You'll now see that if we expand the group, that the wedge is inside of this parent group, and we're going to name this, and I'll just call this My Objects for now. In the future, I don't necessarily need to delete, freeze, center each of these objects individually. When I'm done, I can grab all of them at once, run these, and that will work fine as well. So that's probably the easiest, fastest way to do it, but I did want to show you how to do it on a single shape so that you understand. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and save the scene so that if there's a crash, we don't lose the object that we've already started with. So next I'm going to make the pogo ball shape in this front left corner. Best starting object for that is the sphere. So I'll make a sphere. And again, we need to get it as closely aligned as possible. So I'm going to jump again to the top viewport and use the vertice in the center as a point to snap. Make sure that my vertice snap is on. And it's going to be best in this situation to snap a single axis at a time. So I'm going to grab the red handle, and then again, make sure your mouse is aimed where the vertices align. Then I'll grab the blue handle, and I'll snap it the other direction. While I'm here, I can inspect to see if the divisions going around at least the axis are correct. And you can see that my divisions line up with the provided shape. When you create a sphere, that may or may not be the case. Remember that in the Create Poly Primitive menu, whatever the options of a primitive were last set to and used is going to be the default division count of the object. So if yours is at 10, that's just because that's what was last used. If yours is at 32, etc. If you want to change it permanently, you can come in and edit the object's options, and then it will create those from now on when you use the shelf buttons. Mine does happen to line up, but if yours does not, go to your channel box, and under the input, click on the input for the polysphere, And right here you can edit the subdivision's axis by increasing or decreasing the number until you get the shape to align. Next thing I'm going to do is jump into either the front or side. In this case the front is a little less inhibited. And I want to compare this top to bottom and see if more or less it has the same divisions. So what I'm really comparing here are these horizontal lines. And just moving this a little bit will kind of help me check, and yes indeed, I do have the correct number. Again, if yours does not, play with the subdivision's height until you get them to line up. When we look at this shape, there's a few things we got to pay attention to. There's an indented cone shape top and bottom. And if we look really closely, we can also see that the bottom of that is not flat, that the center vertex is slightly raised. The other thing that we've got is this expansion in the center. The way we're going to create this is through editing the components. We could do this either at the vertex mode or the edge mode, but the easiest way I think for now will be at the top here. I'm going to single select a vertex, and then I'm going to hold shift and double click the one adjacent. This is going to grab the ring. Then I'll hit Q to hide my transform tool, and I want the one in the center as well. So I can hold shift, click, and now I've got that. When I move this downward, let me go back to the front viewport, you'll notice that my pivot point is neither lined up with this bottom row or this top row. It's in the center, and by default the pivot's always going to be in the center of a component or object selection. But we can move this. If we press the D key, we can unlock the pivot and move the pivot around. Because I have snapping mode on, the pivot will also snap. Try not to touch the rotational tools unless you are trying to rotate the pivot. Right now I only want to translate this in Y. Once I get the pivot moved down to a place that I can work with, I can press D and I can lock this pivot. At this point, the new components will move and snap to the selection that I created, and I can move all of this down. You'll notice that this is still a little bit too high, so I can just do a single selection and just bump that down. And now if we look in perspective mode, we can see that we've got that nicely aligned. So we're just going to rinse and repeat this process for the bottom. Only this time I'm going to show you a slightly different method. I'm going to pick just the center vertex and snap only it. Make sure to aim your mouse where you want the snapping point. Now I'm going to right mouse hold and go into edge mode, and since this is an edge loop running around this, I can double click on that edge and select the entire loop, and now move the edge loop by snapping. So either way works, whichever way works best for you is what I would roll with. If we jump back into the front view, we can see this section running right here through the middle that needs expanded. And because I'm in orthographic, if I just drag through, I can grab all of those vertices very easily. And it might be tempting to hit R and go to scale mode and grab this by the center and scale it out. But the problem with doing that is, remember, the center of the tool works in all three vectors, and what we've actually done is scaled the verticality of these apart as well. Because this already aligns, we don't want Y scaling when we do this. So then you may be tempted to try to scale Z and then X. But this would result in possibly something that's uneven. And that also is two steps. We have these planes that represent two axes at a time. If I click on a plane and drag, I can now scale X and Z out at the same time. You'll notice the tool is a little jumpy right now, and part of that is due to the actual size of the gizmo. The smaller the gizmo gets, the less accuracy we're going to have, and we can increase and decrease that with the plus and minus keys. So I'm going to hit plus and make it big, and because I had used that, the plane tool, let me make it small so you can see this, the plane tool is yellow, it has been constrained. So now if I make it really large and zoom in on my object, I can use that virtual slider. I can hold down my middle mouse button and I can slide very more smoothly and more accurately because of the size of the gizmo. And then I can hit minus to shrink the gizmo back down. And there we go. We've got our Pokeball object. Now again, I'm not going to do the center freeze delete on this. I'm going to move on. So I'm just going to take the P-sphere that we started with first off and name it. I'll call this Pogo Ball. And we have a group. We need to put it into the group. One way we can do this is by selecting it and then hold down middle mouse button, and we can drag it. If you see a box, that means you're going to put it inside of the object. If you see a line, it means you're going to drop it between the objects. So if I hover over my object group, see a box and let go, we can place it like that. Another way that we can do this is by first selecting the child object, holding Control, and selecting the group that we want it to go into, or the other object, and then just hit the P key for parent, and that will also group the object. Now I'm going to save so we don't lose if something happens. I'm going to move forward to this object right here. It's sort of like a planter with a hole in the bottom. Easiest starting shape is going to be a pipe. We don't see that here on the shelf. It's not there by default, but we can get to it from Create Polygon Primitives and drop down to Pipe. We need to align it. So we'll spacebar into our top viewport, and we'll take this again using Vert Snap. I'll align it in one axis. I'll align it in the other axis. We'll spacebar into either the front view or the side view to see which view gives us the best angle of the shot. I think I'll use this one. And then we also need to compare divisions. So if we're looking at this in perspective view, my pipe right now doesn't have any height divisions, and the provided shape has 2. And we can see if we look real careful, the provided shape also has 2 divisions on the interior. So in the channel box, inputs for our poly pipe, we need to take subdivisions height and begin to increase this. By doing it that way, we're going to get 2 on the inside and the outside. If I were to add edge loops, I would only get them on the side that I added. And so this way is a little more convenient. We can also get this to be a little bit closer in scale to work with. By playing with the height, we can drag the height up to get it a little closer. And we may want to take the radius value out a little bit, just so it's somewhat more representative of our object. Now at this point, we're going to be doing a bunch of vertices selection and snapping, and then edge loops scaling. So I'm going to come back to an orthographic viewport so that I can drag through the object. I'm going to right mouse hold and go to vertex and drag all of the vertices that are on top. With vertices snapping turned on, I'm going to grab the Y handle and just aim for the top row of the provided object. And then I'm just going to do this all the way down per division so that each of my rows are lined up with the provided object's rows. Now we know that all the divisions line up. Now all we need to do is just scale. And we can do this just manually. It doesn't have to be superbly perfect. We do want to scale this either by the center or by the plane. In this case, since this has no vertical scale, scaling by the center isn't going to change the spread. And all we need to do is just select each row, internal and external, until we get them to be the appropriate size. So I'm going to just go down the list really quick and do this. Internal lines and external lines. Now one thing you may notice, if we were looking at this orthographically, let me choose the other view. The scale that I just did internally is going to be the same on the one right below it. It turns out this has a straight wall. So if you wanted, you could do one at a time and try and get them as close as possible. You could also select both, and instead of using the center, use the planar tool, and this way we can scale it in very accurately as well. Okay, just a couple more loops. I'm going to grab and scale. Same on the bottom, grab and scale. Move up, grab and scale. And the last one, and scale. And we've made the shape. So editing the components can actually be very simple, especially once you get modes of selection down where you can drag through objects or pick and highlight bands. I'm going to name this object. I'll call it planter for lack of a better name, and I'm going to parent it to my object group and save my scene. So the next shapes I'm going to make are very similar in process. The two outside shapes, we're going to start with the cylinder for both. So I'm going to create the cylinder, again look at it from the top, snap to the center point like so, and then compare divisions. My divisions turn out to be correct at 20 access. If yours are not, go ahead and just set that. Now I've got a cylinder that's a good starting point for this, and I'm going to need another one for here. I could go over here and create another one and then snap it into position, or I could just duplicate the one that I have. So with it selected, Control D, and you'll notice that we now have two in the outliner, and then I'll just move the other one over. I'm going to jump into the top view and make sure we get it aligned to center, and it looks like it has the right number of divisions as well. Alright, so here in the back, this one is mostly correct. The only thing that's missing is the vertice in the center needs snapped up, and the one in the center at the bottom needs snapped down. And this should be pretty easy at this point. We'll right mouse into vertex mode and pick a vertice and aim for the top and snap. And we're done with that one. I'll give it a name. I'll call it Plumb Bob. I'll select the cylinder at the front and hit F to focus on it. This one's a little bit different. We can see the bottom is simple, so let's start there. Grab the center vertice and snap it down. We'll take the center vertice at the top and we'll move it down to where it should be. And then we've got all these little spikes going around the object. If you look really close, you'll notice that one vertice, every other, lines up at the bottom of a notch. And here in the center, each of these are the piece that actually needs to go up. So what we're going to do is pick, hold shift, pick, hold shift, and just keep rotating around until we've selected every single one of the vertices that lines up with the center of a spike point. The other thing that's always good to check is if you have your poly count turned on, which can be found under display, heads up, check on poly count. We can see how many edges and verts and faces and components we have selected. And if you look over here, you'll see a 10. And this is telling me that I currently have 10 vertices selected. And if you'll remember, the input has 20 access divisions, so I have every other one selected. And it's just a good thing to check, make sure you didn't miss one. I'm going to hit W. We now have this row of vertices selected, and we're going to snap to the top point. And once we lift those up, we now have this guy made as well. So I'm going to name this one. We'll call this one Spike. And both Spike and Plumb Bob need to be grouped. So I can select them at the same time, then Control select my group and hit P, or I can middle mouse button drag them, either way. We're down to one last shape. This one back here looks sort of like a dog Kong or something. And it might be tempting to try and use a pipe for this and then round the caps, but it's going to result in a slightly weird shape up here at the top, and we'd have to manipulate it a little bit more than necessary to get it made. So what this actually is just a torus that's been stretched and scaled. So torus is the tire-shaped one on the Poly Modeling Toolkit. We'll create that. Jump into your top view, and we'll snap this so that we know it's aligned as close to center as possible. We'll check the axis divisions, and if they don't line up, we'll come into our subdivision axis under the channel box input, and we'll increase or decrease this value until we get it correct. We'll look at this from whichever viewport we get the best alignment, so I get the best in the side viewport. And we need to move it down. So right here is the bottom curvature of the provided object, and my object's up here. So W for translate. And right now it's aligned to center, so that's going to be the point that's snapping. And I'm going to grab the Y handle and aim for this outer row. And then you'll see the bottom curve actually matches perfectly. So what we do need to do is move some of this geometry upward. The vertex row or edge row right there down, this one needs to stay put. This is the one that's actually holding that edge line right there. So it's actually all of the faces and edges above this point that need moved. I'm going to go ahead and turn vertices snapping off for a second and just drag this up where we can see and work with it. Because again we've got a big selection of components, the gizmo is floating in the center of its mass, and this isn't very useful right now because it doesn't line up to anything. It would be easier to use if it lined up with the bottom, the top, or any one of these edges as opposed to just nothing. So again, we're going to press D to unlock the pivot, and then I'm going to snap it to this bottom row of vertices right here, and then press D to lock the pivot. Now this point can be aimed, say at this line, and we can snap it down. And if we do that, you'll notice top to bottom we're nicely aligned. If I spacebar into the perspective viewport, we're just out of scale. Our shape is too big. So if I tap R for scale, it might be tempting to grab the center and scale in, but remember that's going to scale down as well. So what we really want to do here is scale the plane of X and Z. And keep in mind, once you start scaling and you've constrained that, we can press plus to make it bigger, and then just middle mouse drag with a lot more accuracy until we get it lined up. Then minus to shrink your gizmo back down. And there we go. That one's done as well. So last thing I'm going to do is name this. I'll call this Kong. Put it into my object group. Now remember, these do need their pivots centered, their transforms frozen, and their history deleted. We have those 3 buttons on the poly shelf, so I'm going to drag select all of them, center their pivots, delete their history, freeze their transforms. We have them all in a group. They all meet the specifications. They've been named. They're very accurate. The group is named, and we're going to make the viewport line up nice for display. Save our scene. Now our scene will open this way when it's handed off, and it's ready for submission. So I hope this was useful for you guys, and you know a little bit more about component selection and manipulation. We'll just keep moving forward from this point.